My name is Jordan Bush. I am the head of content and education for Thank God for Bitcoin media company. So we exist to help the Christian world understand what Bitcoin is and why it matters, and to basically take Bitcoin to the people who need it the most in the world. And so we want to basically help, just help the people all around the world who've been most affected by one of the most underappreciated, sounds an over-dramatic word, but menaces just to people all around the world. We want to help people understand what it is that's happening, what it is that's been happening and why, and then basically taking and leveraging a variety of tools that Bitcoin has within it, so that those people can benefit from its innovation. And we look at it as something that God, as He's done throughout redemptive history, has provided His people. Has provided His people a tool that they need, both for their good and for His glory. This is something that I'll just give a brief overview of who I am. So basically, my background, I grew up in a Christian family. My mom, was a stay-at-home mom. I had, the benefit of, just that blessing of having a mom who was with me, all the time, and who just was able to spend time with me. Went to Christian school for a number of years. My parents have worked in ministry my entire life. And so I've had tremendously blessed life in a ton of ways. And so I grew up not appreciating that at all. From the time when I was about in third or fourth grade, I just got to a point where I was going to school, I was going to a public school at that point. There was no other Christians. And so over time, I just said, I just want to have friends. I just want to be normal. And so just over time, I just kind of drifted, away from the Lord. And so in God's providence and His grace, I went to this camp when I was a teenager in high school, went there to play basketball, which I jokingly say, but actually in truth was my real, God, and I would worship at the altar for 3 or 4 hours a day and, do that. I went there to play basketball and chase girls, as one does, and the Lord had different plans. In His providence, there was a man named Tom Phillips who was there. And Tom was like another dad to me. He was one of my dad's best friends. And he just basically had been this guy who, even though I was not his kid, he was always thinking about me. And he would go out of town and preach the gospel at these different evangelistic events. And he would come back and he'd bring me like a hockey puck or something. I couldn't care less about hockey. But I just remember being blown away that this guy who wasn't a blood relation to me was just always thinking about me. And so in God's providence, 10 years later, he's the one who happens to be preaching the gospel at this camp that I had zero interest in being at. My dad tried to get me to read the Bible, and I just remember literally throwing the Bible down and just saying, "This book is stupid." This book is stupid. It's a waste of time. Why would I waste my life with this stupid book? And the stupid book and the God who wrote it had the last laugh, because it was a couple years later. Again, I had zero interest in hearing the gospel. I'd heard the same message a million times. The gospel's preached, and I go from having zero desire to read it, to pray, anything, zero desire. I hear the gospel preached, and the only thing I want to do after that service is go read the Bible and pray. I would have told you were an idiot if you would have told me that would have been a desire that I genuinely had. I would have told you were a complete idiot. And so years later, in God's providence, my wife and I got married. We met at Bible college. We became missionaries, and we took the gospel to people in the country of Uruguay. We went to Uruguay thinking that we were going to be ministering primarily to, primarily to atheistic, secular Uruguayans. This is, like over almost 50% of the people in Uruguay claim to be atheist or agnostic. And so we went there. I'd been, was a philosophy major in college and just was really preparing myself for what I thought that ministry was going to look like. And we get there, and right as we're arriving, there's a wave of 60,000 Venezuelan immigrants pouring into Uruguay. I don't know anything about economics, anything along these lines. I've studied the Bible and philosophy. This is kind of my areas. And so as we were seeing these people, their lives are getting turned upside down. We have people who are doctors, economists, making six-figure salaries denominated in dollars in their local currency, who 3 or 4 years later can't pay the rent in Uruguay. We had men who were leaving their families. Some of them were, those relationships ended in divorce, ended in infidelity. You had numerous children being raised without their, thousands of children being raised without their dads because their dad was living in another country trying to send them home money. So the more that I saw how devastating the effect of, what I found was currency devaluation, I just thought, how have I never heard about this? I've never heard about this anywhere from any class or anything. How can this really be this devastating? And I've never heard about it at all. And so as I went down that road to just try to understand why is this happening? I just found more and more answers. And the more answers that I found, I just find myself what in the world can be done about this? This just seems so hopeless. It's happened. Most of the currencies in Latin America, especially, have failed 3 to 4 times in the last 50 years. And so the question was, what is there that can really be done about this? And so, again, the Lord has used foolish things to shame the wise for thousands of years. And when I started learning about Bitcoin, of all ridiculous things, I just remember thinking, man, this seems like it actually fixes a lot of the incentive alignment problems that are in the existing system. And I started to see not just theoretically that this was happening, I started seeing this happen and hearing this happening from people working all over the world. And so, again, the more that I started going down that rabbit hole, I started seeing, not only is this a good tool that is being used by people to reverse the perverse incentives and the oppression of the poorest and most vulnerable people on earth, but on top of that, a lot of these incentives and the way that Bitcoin was designed, the choices that were made within the Bitcoin, in the early days of Bitcoin, those choices as they cemented, those choices were based in a far more in a far more natural, as crazy as that sounds, in a far more intellectually rigorous and just far more aligned with the way that the world actually works. And so the more that I understood it, the more that I started, this had nothing to do with, after the first little bit, I wasn't thinking about making money. I'm just trying to understand this tool and understand why it works and understand the ways that it's working. So the more that I did that, I started seeing, this whole time I'm a pastor in Uruguay, I'm doing sermon prep, I'm studying and I'm studying passages, and some of these passages that are talking about money, and I'm going to be just unpacking one of those in a little bit, but the more that I'm seeing these passages in Scripture, I'm thinking about this question of what is money, and I'm thinking about the information that I found in studying Bitcoin, the more that I just found myself just thinking, man, this thing is just so aligned with the Christian vision for the world and the Christian set of priorities that it was weird to me. It was just really weird. I'm like, surely I am the only weirdo in the world who is a Christian who's thinking about Bitcoin at this level. And then, here 4 or 5 years later, I found out there's a whole bunch of you weirdos who are all equally interested in this thing. And so it was right around that time that I happened to be on Twitter and saw this other weirdo post this thing about Jesus and Bitcoin. And I just remember, literally, it had never crossed my mind that there was somebody else out there. And so I just immediately DM'd him. I was like, hey man, I can't believe you just said that. I've been thinking a lot of these same things. And so he's like, hey, there's a group of us who are in this Telegram chat, and we're doing this book club. Do you want to find out about it? I just remember thinking, cool, yeah. Like COVID was just starting. It was, what was it, March of 2020. And so it's through that process that I get into this Telegram chat and I find Robert Breedlove is in there. Robert Breedlove, okay. I find Jimmy Song, who I had no clue who he was at this point. Jimmy has like 350,000 followers on Twitter, and I'm like, I don't know who this guy is. And as we started studying these, just reading through these books about just what is money, answering the what is money question from a Christian perspective, reading guys like Gary North, Jörg Guido Holzman, just reading these great books that these men are just thinking deeply and taking seriously both what the scriptures say and then the way and just the history of just monetary history, the history of money around the world, and the choices and the consequences that they provoke and produce. So we ended up writing this book called Thank God for Bitcoin. Goodness gracious. Which, again, the first time I heard the name Thank God for Bitcoin, I was like, what a ridiculous name. Who in the world would never, I went to like Bible college, I would never choose the name Thank God for Bitcoin. And again, in the 4 years since we've written the book, I think about it all the time. I just think the name is so ridiculous that it works. Like, it's so ridiculous, and yet it's so true. And this is what we've come to realize, and this is why we thought it was important enough to do this conference, is there's an element to hearing the phrase "thank God for Bitcoin" that makes you cringe. Because you're just like, what are you talking about? What are you doing? Thanking God for something as ridiculous as Bitcoin. Seemingly it's just so unimportant in the grand scheme of things, so small, even if you think it's important, so small. Like, what in the world? Can you seriously mean that? Or is this just some marketing, gimmick? And the more that I think about it, I just began to just really push back against that idea. Because if you think about, if we're Christians, we believe literally that the world fell on the surface because of a piece of fruit that was taken in disobedience to God and eaten. And so if something is seemingly innocent and seemingly not a big deal, as eating a piece of fruit could have much more gravity and much more sinister consequences, then we have to be careful about prejudging and about being quick to declare something ridiculous or great or whatever. And so as we started to, we did an event last year, some of you guys were there, 6 weeks preparation. It was ridiculous. It should not have worked. And again, by God's grace, it did. And so as we were talking in the aftermath of that conference, Jimmy and a couple other guys, Lyle Pratt, they just basically said, hey, like this, you could actually have a job like doing this if you were interested in it. And I had a whole set of circumstances that we were going through, trying to figure out what we're going to do going forward. And so I'd come to the conference in Miami trying to look for at least a part-time job. And then in the aftermath of the conference, we just saw, hey, there's this opportunity. There's lots of weirdos out here who, really care about Bitcoin, really care about ministries all over the world, really see the ways that fiat currency now and in history has devastated and destroyed families, ministries, prevented the gospel from going forth and from prospering and producing the effect that it could have in many ways. And so as we thought about that, and I thought about just that reality, I just came to a point where I thought to myself, man, the Lord has uniquely positioned the people who were involved, uniquely positioned us in this weird moment, in some ways a very weird moment, and in some ways a pretty perfect moment to do this. And so as we started to think through what is this going to look like? What is our mission statement going to be? We want to, the first thing was we see everything. I mean, Jesus said the greatest commandment is to love God and love your neighbor. And so we saw, okay, the way that we think about Bitcoin has to incorporate both of these things. And so we're brainstorming, we're sitting there, okay, what does this look like? And so again, the Thank God for Bitcoin exists to equip the church to use and understand Bitcoin and leverage it for the glory of God and the good of people all over the world, both today and then going into the future. And many of these things, again, as great as this event is, we can only do so much. And so the beautiful thing about this is you guys are going to be, you guys are literally the ones who are going to take this information and other information from the rest of this conferences, and you're going to take it out, and there's going to be people whose lives are changed. And so we're grateful that you guys are here. We're thrilled just to have you here and to have you involved in to be able to build relationships with the other people who are here. There are people who I met a year ago who have become some of my dear friends. Dear friends. There's people who were sitting in the pews last year who are now working. So watch out. Be careful who you talk to, because we're going to put you to work. So I'm gonna leave it there for right now. We should have let's see. Right now, Pastor C.R. Wiley. Let's see. You got him set up. Pastor C.R. Wiley is gonna come. Pastor C.R. Wiley. I don't know how many of you guys know Pastor C.R. Wiley's work. I guess you're familiar with his work. Okay. He's written a number of books. He's been a pastor. He's been a pastor. Written a number of books. Let's see. Is he here right now? Let me just verify that he's here. Oh, Swan's next. I'm so sorry. Swan, come on up. Who is speaking for Swan right now? Rafa? I just saw him in the back. Oh, there he's getting his mic on. Okay, we're good. So yeah, we are super thrilled. So again, when we started Thank God for Bitcoin, again, we started this very intentionally. We said to ourselves, okay, we can't just work with anybody. We can't just choose any random person who's willing to, throw money behind something. We have to choose specific people who we want to partner with. There was 3 companies that we wanted to partner with. As of right now, as of this year, we're partnering with 2 of them. And Swan is one of them. And so Swan, why is that? Why Swan of all people? So there are a bunch of Bitcoin exchanges out there that sell every kind of coin under the sun. Now, why do they do that? Because with every single trade that is made, they make 1% to 2% off of every one of those trades. And so if your goal is just to make money in the short term, then you are incentivized to sell every coin under the sun, regardless of how ridiculous, useless anything. You're just incentivized to do that. When I heard about Swan, and I saw Swan literally only sells Bitcoin. They believe in Bitcoin. It's the only thing that they want to put their name behind. At that point, I just was like, man, these guys, the realization of these guys are potentially leaving, in the last couple of years, leaving millions of dollars on the table in the short term by choosing to do what they think is right, rather than just accumulating as much as dollars as they could and justifying it based on all the good that they could do in future years. They just didn't do that. And so, again, we are super just thrilled and grateful to have Swan partnering with us. So if you want to come on up, Rafa, we'd love to have you. Give him a warm round of applause.
Morning, everybody. So yeah, I think actually that's a good segue, because I joined Swan now about 6 months ago. Tell a little bit about myself, but I've been, as many of you, looking at Bitcoin for a while. And when I looked at the different places, right, I couldn't think of a better place to work than Swan. A little bit about myself. I've worked, I'm originally from Brazil, so I was born and raised in Rio. And grew up there, and not from a very wealthy family, but I always thought, one day I want to go study abroad. So I saved money. I tried to save money. I think one of the things that made me a Bitcoiner was living in Brazil in the 80s and the 90s and seeing, hyperinflation and living with all of that, and seeing that money literally at some point overnight, we would have money just be worthless. I remember stories like my mother giving me money to school, and she would give me the money in the morning. It's like, oh, here's, 5 cruzados or whatever the currency was at the time. And she would tell me, she's like, you get this money, you're not supposed to bring anything back home, because if you bring anything back home tomorrow, this is going to be worth less than it is today. So I had to spend everything that day and buy things that day. In fact, there was a time I remember, like, between recesses in the morning, prices would go up. So you would go in the first recess, the price would be one, and then come back to buy something, the price would be higher. You know, you're talking about inflation of like 100% and more per month. So I kind of think that that got me a little bit primed to become a Bitcoiner down the road. The other thing that got me, I think, very interested in Bitcoin is that I always loved technology from an early age. Started coding really early, and then ended up not working in technology, but in finance, but that's a different story. But fast forward, I was able to save some money at some point, although I lost a lot with devaluations of currencies along the way. So in 2001, I moved to the US to get my master's degree. And then, you know, what was supposed to be just a couple of years in the US became 16 years. So I lived 16 years in the US. Both my kids were born here. But then in 2016, I moved back to Brazil. While here, I worked mostly in financial services industry. So I worked at Goldman, worked at Merrill, doing everything, doing trading, doing asset allocation for very wealthy clients from these companies. Worked for Deutsche Bank as well. And then when I moved to Brazil, I started two companies. I started an investment banking company. And then I also started what became one of the largest fintechs in Latin America, OpenCo. So I did a little bit of everything, but in this whole time, I always had Bitcoin kind of like a side project. For a long time, it was, I wouldn't talk to a lot of my colleagues about Bitcoin. I remember like having discussions about Bitcoin in, as you can imagine, the financial industry, and just people telling me I'm crazy, that this is magic internet money and all of that. So for a long time, I kind of like kept that separate, but always as kind of a hobby, I continued to do things in Bitcoin and, you know, coding, contributing to open source projects, and of course, following Bitcoin Twitter. And I became friends with Corey a while back. You know, we were both criticizing a lot of the scams that unfortunately we have in the space. And it made, you know, as I got out of my company last year, it made a lot of sense to start thinking about how I could use, I think, some of my skills in better ways to kind of, you know, try to increase adoption, because that's all that we're trying to do at Swan at the end of the day. I'm very sorry, but I'm going to talk about asset allocation and Bitcoin this early in the morning. That's not an easy topic, so it's going to be a little bit of math, but I'll try to make this as light as possible. It's also, we don't have a lot of time, so I'm going to cover a lot of these things very, very quickly. But a funny story, I knew I was going to do this presentation, right? So I was thinking, okay, so I'm going to talk about asset allocation in churches. I'm Jewish, so you know I couldn't call my church, so I called my rabbi last week, and I called him up and I said, Rabbi, you know, I'm doing this presentation, and I got to think about, you know, asset allocation. How should we be thinking about putting Bitcoin in your portfolio? And he knows I'm a Bitcoiner. I've spoken with Bitcoin with him in the past. He doesn't own any Bitcoin yet. But it's funny, as soon as I told him, oh, I'm going to go talk to the Catholic Church about Bitcoin, he got much more interested. And it's like, oh, maybe we should talk about that and having that in our portfolio. So it's a little bit of game theory, I think, for all of us. So I told him, like, so tell me, I asked him, tell me about what, you know, how do you manage your money right now? So first of all, he doesn't, of course, you know, somebody at our congregation that manages, has a financial background that manages the assets. And surprise, surprise, it's 100% in cash, right? Which in his case, it makes a little bit of sense because the synagogue has very high liquidity needs. But I think that when we think about asset allocation for churches, right, a couple of things, and religious organizations in general, right, a couple of things we need to think. The first one is, of course, preservation of capital. That's the most important thing, right? So cash makes sense, absolutely, because you want to make sure that your assets are not going to be lost. You want, in a lot of these cases, income generation. You want the assets to be generating some kind of dividend along the way. You want to have long-term growth. And you also want to make sure that the assets that you hold, they're going to align with the mission and the vision that you have for your organization, right? And I'm not going to touch on this point, but I think, again, Bitcoin is probably one of the best assets for fundamental reasons. You're going to hear about that all day long today, so I don't need to touch on this point and why ethically, fundamentally, it fits a lot with the mission of, I think, of different organizations. But let's go again back to the synagogue, right? So I asked him, so how do you allocate? And he's like, well, I have roughly 80% of my assets in very short-term treasuries, right? So this is like 3-month treasuries. And then 20% of it, we actually take a little bit of risk. We'll diversify by buying longer-term treasuries, but it's still treasuries, right? And that's one point. Like people say, well, we're diversifying, we're buying stocks, we're buying equities, we're buying bonds, we're buying long-term bonds, we're buying different corporate bonds. They're all denominated in the same thing, fiat, right? So you're not diversifying fiat at all. You still have highly concentrated allocation to one asset that, you know, even with a small probability, if we have a collapse in fiat, you have no insurance whatsoever. The other thing, which I think it makes a lot of sense to think now, we are in a situation now that, so the chart there on the right, it's a 3-month treasury. So right now, and this is the yield a long time, so one of the things you can see is, of course, we had a long period where interest rates were very, very low, close to zero. In some places, they actually went negative, right, which is, that's a whole complete different discussion, but it's just something that shouldn't happen. But what we're seeing right now, it's not typical of what we've seen in the last few decades. We have interest rates, which that means, you know, particularly for organizations that are cash heavy, they can use a lot of the yield that is being generated by these assets to buy Bitcoin. So if they start, you know, let's say, for example, somebody has 100% in treasuries right now, treasuries yielding 5%, without taking out any of the assets that they have, keeping the whole principal protected, they can use that 5% along 1 year to stack sats, and they're going to have a 5% allocation to Bitcoin after 1 year. They should take advantage of that, because that's not going to be the case. I guarantee, you know, 1 year, 2 years, 3 years down the road, rates are probably going to go down from where we are. In fact, if you actually look at the futures market, that's what's happening. So how does a Bitcoin allocation would help a portfolio like this? By the way, before I go there, one of the things we're doing at Swan is we're providing these tools that I'm showing here. And again, I'm just not going to have time today to go through everything, but they are all online. They're 100% free. They're open source. If you go to nakamotoportfolio.com, you have tools to analyze pretty much any portfolio you want. There's a lot of information there. You can run the numbers yourself, right? But we did run the numbers. I did run the numbers for the cash allocation that I just mentioned. And a couple of things you can see here, even at small amounts of Bitcoin, right? So if you look at on the left-hand side, just by adding 1% Bitcoin to this portfolio, historically, you would have double the returns. So returns would go from 1% roughly to 2.2%. And then the first thing that comes to mind is like, yeah, but that adds volatility, right? Well, it does. Volatility goes up from 1.3 to 1.6, but that's not substantial. Even at larger amounts, right? So if you look at the 5% allocation, a 5% allocation would significantly increase returns. It would also increase volatility, but the Sharpe ratio at the end, that's just dividing one by the other, so the higher the better. You have better risk-adjusted returns by adding a larger position of Bitcoin. But again, I'm not going to go through a lot of details here. The other thing that people look a lot is, and we have this available there, is looking at drawdown. So looking at periods where your portfolio would be down. What you see there is even at the 5% allocation, the drawdowns that you experience with Bitcoin are not significantly higher. So it makes a lot of sense. And we've been running this not only for religious organizations, but we've been running this for corporates that have a lot of cash, individuals also that are sitting on a lot of cash. And I'm still to find a portfolio where we ran the numbers and the asset allocation with Bitcoin didn't make sense. It always makes sense. It's a matter at the end of the day of trying to find the right risk that you want to take. So the investor will tell us, this is the amount of drawdown that I'm willing to take, this is the amount of risk we're willing to take, and then we run the numbers, we'll try to find what the proper allocation is. So if you guys have your treasurer, anybody that you think should be looking at Bitcoin and want to direct us to have these conversations, we're happy to do that. Dante is here from Swan. Dante can help setting up the meetings and again, having these conversations. But I'll stop here. I said that this wasn't going to be long. If you guys have any questions, I'm going to be around all day long and we can talk in detail. Thank you.